Well, thank you very much.
I knew I was with a popular guy, Robert.
Paul, I have to say it is my greatest pleasure and privilege to be invited to do this.
Thank you, Robert.
I hope by the end of my questions the reason for me saying that will be clear. But anyhow, it's from the bottom of my heart.
Well, thank you for doing it. You're the best one to do it.
But I'm going to make sure that it's not entirely comfortable for either of us.
No.
We want to have a rough and tumble time as well. The reason for this conversation is that Paul Keating has produced what I think is a highly agreeable, highly stimulating, and I think vividly and beautifully written book, and I recommend it to you. It's a book with a lot in it, just things that struck me, which I won't be questioning Paul about, but things that struck me. There is, for example, an extremely moving eulogy for the musical genius Geoffrey Tozer. There's an incredibly interesting essay on the Potsdamer Platz in Berlin, where Paul argues that it should have been allowed to remain in ruins as humanity's, what he calls, unsacred site, as to what the darkest moment of the 20th century. There's even, as some of you won't be surprised to hear, an analysis of Mahler's Second Symphony, which I listened to in deference to Paul on the way down in my car and was yet again astonished by it. It was a transcendental moment in music. The approach I'm going to take today is to cover many of the issues raised in Paul's book, and I'll do so on the basis of things that you say. There's much that we won't have time to discuss, but I'll do my best to cover what is an astonishing tour d'horizon of Australia in recent times and also the world. I think we should begin with the, what some will say the most important thing you did, which was the economic reforms in the period between 1983 and 1996, you as Treasurer first, then as Prime Minister. And perhaps the way to begin to talk about that is a conversation you once had with Tony Blair, where he spoke, as people did, of the third way, and you corrected him, as is your wont, and said, not the third way, the only way. Yeah. Perhaps you could begin by telling us what you meant by that.
Yeah. Well, I always was, there was something dismal about the economic debate that the choices that were given to countries, we're talking here of the 20th century, was that private initiative and private reward was everything. If the rich people got the money, we'd all be okay. There'd be a trickle-down effect and you'd have a bigger economy. And on the other hand, a government control and government initiative was the alternate way. And we've seen that carried out. I don't mean simply communism or Marxism, but essentially in societies where you had the government had a very large say about the way the place operated, if not centrally planned. And that was the choice, and you could see it, you had Calvin Coolidge in the late 20s and 30s who gave you the private initiative and private reward. Then you had Roosevelt, who believed there was a role for government, as there was a role for the private economy, And this thing has sort of alternated all its way, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and then Ronald Reagan, back to private initiative. And I always thought there was a better way than that, and that had to be one where you recognise that that in the end, if these economies didn't produce enough GDP, enough employment, enough growth, that if there was not enough productivity to produce new product, there's no way any Labor Party or any other outfit was going to shift national income to their constituency from a pool which was essentially emaciated, you know.
Yes.
So therefore, the main thing we had to do was to lift employment and lift GDP and lift employment. And from that, we could have a more effective economy, a more efficient economy, and in that context, all the social wage questions could be dealt with. You know, access and equity in, first of all, employment, you know. Secondly, access and equity in education, universal health protection, in our case, retirement incomes. These were the things. It didn't seem to me you were stretching too much of a point to argue, hang on, we'll have this efficient economy, but at the same time we'll have all these things that matter socially. And who was to say, no, you had to have one or the other? So that was really, I think, the change. And of course, let me say that, you know, we had, in my years, a trade union movement which was, had an industrial agenda. So the key thing is, Robert, is the Labor Party always had an industrial agenda. If you look at my agenda, it's fundamentally industrial. Yeah. It's employment, you know, it's protection for people, it's minimum rates of awards for those on the bottom end of the labour market, it's getting their kids into school and university, it's giving them a retirement, something in retirement. It's fundamentally the industrial agenda. But we had a labour movement that saw that, and therefore we had these trade-offs, you know, in the freer economy, but the trade-off for the social objectives. Yes. And those trade-offs were promoted in those days by the ACTU and, of course, led by Bill Kelly. Yeah.
You say, actually, in a striking phrase, that what was important about the market reforms, which, you know, really you'll be remembered in history for, that they were done with a Labor heart. I just wanted to speculate about the alternative if it had been the Liberal Party that had introduced those reforms, what you think might have happened.
Yeah. Well, when I say the Labor heart, they were, the big reform, if you like, there's a whole lot of important reforms: exchange rate, the financial and the product markets, and of course the labour market. If I take the last one first, we moved away from the safe house of centralised wage fixing to a system of enterprise bargaining, but where the Commonwealth was not involved. That is, where enterprises could negotiate with unions, but with unions which had a collective process, not unions split off into individual wage contracts, but unions in the collective. And in that, we knew that in an economy in transition, a lot of people get left behind. So we had a commitment to minimum rates for people, the low paid, for people who are disadvantaged, women in retail, kids, etc. And of course we had this thing called the no disadvantage test. You could go and make an enterprise bargain, but you couldn't be any worse off. The working person could be no worse off than before. Well, what the Libs did when they arrived in office, Reith and Howard kept the enterprise bargaining but wanted to take the collectivism out of unionism. 2, they explicitly took the no disadvantage test away. Finally, of course, with work choices, they attacked the safety net, you know, and that's it. And you say to them, but hang on, why would you do this when productivity was running at 2 to 3%? Why would you do this when the inflation rate was 2.5% consistently? When industrial disputation was at record lows? You know, why would you do this when the profit share in GDP had never been higher?
And what's the explanation as to?
Ideology and viciousness. A kind of viciousness. A kind of that sort of middle class I used to say the Liberal Party is full of, used car salesmen and real estate agents and news agents. There were never any big business figures there. If they had, they might have been a bit better. But it was that miserableness, that miserableness. So Howard, we gave Howard the right model, We gave Howard the right model, but quick as a flash, he couldn't get through. He had the problems with the Senate, but quick as a flash, he was negotiating to move to single contracts, and then when he got control of the Senate, eventually got control of the Senate straight away, he hopped into the safety net, the no disadvantage test and everything else. So, that's the way they are. The only thing the Liberal Party ever accepted from us, but after 7 elections, was Medicare. We had to drag them to it.
Yes.
In the end, they finally said, even after they forced you into private health cover, they finally accepted Medicare. But no matter how much peace and goodwill the trade unions or the structure offered business in the new model, they wouldn't take it. If I could go back to other things, in the product markets, of course, we reduced the tariffs, which had, of course, enormous impact on manufacturing centres like Melbourne and Sydney. But we had in there adjustment packages to try and help people out. But the biggest adjustment package was their ability to jump out of a protected job into a new job in a burgeoning economy.
Yeah.
That was the thing. And then, of course, deregulation. People say, people on the left of the Labor Party used to say in the early days, I'd swallowed some kind of an economic textbook, But look, you couldn't. Banks, there were deposit maturity controls, how much a bank could take in deposits and from whom, and there were lending controls. The Reserve Bank set the quantitative lending restriction, and the Australian banks would lend within the restriction, and they'd only lend to the best customers. So banks were rationers of credit. What we did was turn them into creators of credit. So that meant any two butchers could go and buy the site opposite and build 24 units. And then they could sell them off the plan because people knew they could settle the contract at the end. They could pay the loan out because they could get it from the bank. So if you look at the creation of wealth in Australia, the opening up of the banking system was, and yet inside the Labor Party in those days, we used to find people, they believed in credit unions, they believed in permanent building societies, but they didn't believe in banks. And these were the prudentially supervised shows. So, in other words, broadly what I was involved with and what we did was, use an old word but not in its worst sense, pragmatic, learning the lessons of history and not ideological, looking what had to be done and doing it. And therefore, Tony Blair talking about the third way as if he'd found some sort of golden chalice which had, was a bit of nonsense, because the first and second ways were, we tried them through the Depression, we tried them, they failed, and this was the right way. And we did it here in Australia 15 years before Britain.
One of the things that really struck me, I'd thought about it but not as carefully as until I read one of your speeches, or a couple, is the tragedy of having lost the larger superannuation objective under the Howard government. Just those who haven't thought about this, one of the great social wage reforms was compulsory superannuation at 9%, but it was always to go to 15%. To give a decent life to those in the future. Could you say something about that?
Yeah,
what do you think?
sure.
Why was that abandoned? The larger hope.
Yeah. Well, one of my friends abroad is Marty Feldstein. He's a professor of economics at Harvard. He's the chairman of the National Bureau of Economic Research in America, and he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to President Reagan. Right. So this is no lefty. Right. This is no lefty. And he said, Paul, you've got the strangest Conservative Party in the world. And I said, why do you think? He said, well, you at least expect Conservative parties to believe in thrift. when a Labor government comes along, imagine, he said, in America, the Democratic Party coming along and getting the organised workforce to agree to put 15% of their income away as savings, you would kiss them for it, you know. He said, but I could never understand that John Howard and that Peter Costello, you know, cutting your scheme in half. And that's what they did. You see, in the last budget I presided over, Ralph Willis's budget, 1995, under the Accord Mark 8, which I did with Bill Kelty and the ACTU, we had the SGC running up to 9 in single point steps to 2001. And then what we were going to do was pay income tax cuts as savings, not cash. So in 97-8, 98-9 and 99-2000, we do 1-1-1. But this came conditional with what we called the co-payment. The unions agreed that they would match the government 1% with one of their own. In other words, the next wage round they'd have, the employers would hold back 1% and pay it into their super account, right? So we had 1 and 1, 2, 1 and 1 again, 4, 1 and 1 again, 6. 6 on the 9 became 15. Yeah. Now, in the 96 election, the media pressed John Howard about this subject, and he said he would maintain the commitment of the Keating government to superannuation. Of course, they broke it in their first budget. Yeah. Broke it in the first budget. And then Costello had this rinky-dink scheme where their people's savings deposits would get some tax concessionality, and that lasted 9 months and they took it away. So what they did, they cost the average working family, working person, $300,000 in the accumulation over their lifetime. So you see, the current scheme at 9%, if you join the workforce at 22 and you go through to say 55 or 60, and your fund earns about 6.5% a year, you get to what the phrase is a replacement rate. A rate of income in retirement replacing your income, but it's about 40 to 45% of your current income. This is not enough. Whereas at 15%, we're more or less at 90 or 100. So you would go into retirement fundamentally not needing the age pension. You know, the thing would carry you through. And we had a wrinkle in there where if you took an annuity, in other words, you took a cash payment, you gave your lump to a provider of annuities and they gave you a monthly wage, we relieved the tax for you. Costello took this away in 2006, so now people can take their lump sum, spend the money and then line up for the pension. You know, yeah. Crazy.
Can I ask, this is a historian's question, something I've often wondered about, and it's to do with that process of, you know, floating currency, financial deregulation, anti-tariff, end of protectionism, competition policy, privatisation and so on. How far, when you entered the Treasury 83, was the whole process kind of in your mind? How far did it emerge from one crisis to the next? And secondly, was the Treasury at one in those changes, and were you at one with the Prime Minister in those changes? Big question. Yeah. I know we can't go into the real history of it. Let me go to the last part first.
Bob and I were at one in all of those changes. Bob and I were a great partnership, you know, in these things. Bob's instincts were good instincts for doing this stuff. You know, we fell out in the end because he stopped doing the hard stuff and he didn't want to do it anymore. In which case he was no more use to me to get the things done. See?
What year was that?
99. That was about 80. After the May statement of May 88.
The tariff statement.
After that, and extending dividend imputation, changing the tax treatment of super, all of that, there was no real impetus anymore for change, and we went through this lull, 89 and 90. We got through the election in 90, and then there was a big blue in the cabinet about something Bob wanted to do in the Northern Territory. I forget the name of the place now. Anyway, it was all off the main beam. So the kind of reform period sort of closed off, you could say, about 89. And so, of course, when that happened, we slid through in 1990 with 39% of the vote. People forget this, I mean, Bob's highest election result was 83, 84 was down, 87, 90. You didn't have to be a political scientist to know we were curtains the next time. And he didn't want to do any more changes. So that was it. But before that, he was great. And but the Treasury... Was
the Treasury divided on...
Yeah, well, the Treasury under John Stone, the Treasury was a product of its own self, in a way. It believed in markets, but particularly the markets it ran. You see, when I became Treasurer, the exchange rate was on the cabinet table. Interest rates were on the cabinet table. Wages through the Arbitration Commission and the Commonwealth's role was effectively on the cabinet table. Tariffs were on the cabinet table. And the Treasury kind of liked having them on the cabinet table. And so the new construct of the Australian economy was more or less radically conceived. It was not conceived by the departments. That's not to say they didn't help it, or there were not people in there who agreed with us. That's true. I think you would find almost everyone in the Treasury wanted to be rid of tariffs and quotas. But not the float of the exchange rate.
John Stone opposed that.
He opposed the float, and so did Des Moore. You see Des writing in the Melbourne papers now, a great market person. Well, he was like John. They wanted to hang on to the exchange rate. They wanted to, and when I wanted to let the banks off, take deposit maturity and lending controls off them, they didn't like that either. So the market instincts of the changes came from the cabinet. They didn't come from the Treasury.
And resistance in cabinet, or was it?
Well, it was for a lot of people until we got the model up and going. I mean, there were still a lot of people who believed in big budget deficits provide more growth. You just put people on the government payroll and you decide how big the economy will grow by how much the government spends. This was very much ingrained. And
just the final part of that, and then I want to move on to the non-economic parts of your Prime Ministership. But the question I've always wondered about, which I adverted to before, is were you aware early on of how dramatic a shift was going to happen, with you and Bob Hawke in the economy? Or did it was it one crisis after another driving it on?
Yeah, not really. I said to Bob, look, the Whitlam government got 3 years effectively. I said, we might be lucky to get 6, We're better to go for broke. Do the changes, You see, look, one of the things I hate political people saying in Australia, they have great regard for they love the Australian people and they have great regard for them. But not so much regard as to tell them the truth, Not so much regard as to take them into the conversation, and not so much regard to make good public policy decisions in their best interests, And if you do the cut through, you do the stuff and you cut through, well, you're somebody who doesn't understand the Australian people. They dig out some poll to tell you that you don't get them. You're sort of. So I always thought, look, even if we last the 3 years, we'll get the exchange rate off the table, we'll get interest rates off the table. With a bit of luck, we'll get tariffs off the table. I would never have shifted Bob on the wages system. Bob loved the award system. And the award system in the end had run out of puff. We couldn't get within sector wage flexibility, and therefore we couldn't get the productivity.
How crucial in changing that was Bill Kelty, in your judgment? Central to it. And I mean, he's the Labor leader who saw the absolute pointlessness in the end run of centralised wage fixing, and that we had to go, to lift real incomes, we had to have a burst we had to get a productivity out of businesses fundamentally, and we couldn't get it out of the centralised system. And I rang the Treasury before this book cycle of discussion started about this book. I rang the Treasury about 4 weeks ago and I asked the Secretary, Martin Parkinsons, what was the increase in real wages since 1991 in Australia, on average? Yep.
taking the ups and downs. And the answer was 1.74%. So you multiply 1.74, by those 20 years, and you end up with a 35.5% real increase in wages. The highest real increase, let's take all the nonsense out of it, 1/3 real increase above inflation over a 20-year period.
Utterly different from what's happened in the US over that period.
Same period in the US, zero.
Yeah.
Real wages have not risen in America since 1990. They've maintained nominal wages with inflation, but real wages have not climbed. Here we're up 35%. Now that came from the change. That came from the abolition of centralised wage fixing. But as I said earlier, Howard couldn't resist, knocking off the unions in their collective bargaining. He couldn't resist knocking off the no disadvantage test. He couldn't resist knocking off minimum rates, and of course now they're whinging that the Gillard government has gone back beyond the structure I had to give the Commonwealth more of a role, but they bought all this themselves, Yeah.
Paul, do you think sometimes you told too much of the truth? I'll give you a couple of examples. I wonder whether you regret them. One is to say, unless we do X, Y, we're a banana republic. Then the exchange rate drop. The other, I suppose the one that's famous is, you'll know what I'm about to say, I think, the recession we had to have.
Yeah. Well, you see, what happened was, I'll go to the second one first. We had 7 years of the Accord holding wages growth around 6%, but inflation was running at 9 to 10. And we're making the gap up with tax cuts. Fundamentally, Bill Kelty had to hold the game together at 6.5%. The banks went crazy. After deregulation, Westpac, the ANZ Bank in particular, less so the CBA and NAB, went mad, lent to anybody to try and keep the foreign banks out. They were in, but to try and keep them out of the market. Essentially, they lit the place up so that by 1989, we had people in the oil industry offering 14%. Management. This meant we'd go back to double-digit inflation. In other words, we could never beat the dismal cycle of the Australian economy always going back to double-digit inflation. In other words, we come up, we go down, come up, we go down, There had to be a break on that, and that break had to come. Now, what happened? It ended up worse than it should have been, and it ended up kind of worse for sort of explainable reasons. You remember the stock market crash of 1987? It was really a big event. Markets went down by 27%. It was like 1933 coming again. And at the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bankers club, Bob Johnson, who was the governor of the Reserve Bank, attended there, and they were convinced that we had a 1933 on our hands. So all through 1988, the stock market crash of 87 happened at the end of 87. All through 88, the Reserve Bank kept monetary conditions soft here, accommodating, soft. And I said to Bob, look, Bob, there's a bare transfer out of stocks into property, I said, look, you go to Sydney and Melbourne, there are cranes everywhere. The idea we're going to have a massive collapse, but we had these big positions. We had News Corp with 10 billion, and Rupert was in trouble with 10 billion. We had Alan Bond with about 10 billion. We had Robert Holmes Corp with 10 billion. And those days, 10 billion was 10 billion. It was going to knock the balance sheets of big banks around, So we were at them to put the rates up. They wouldn't do it for the reasons they thought they knew better. So we kept monetary conditions accommodating through 88. What had happened by that stage, it had really taken off. So in the end, the rates had to go up to 17 or 18% to stop it. And then in 1990, Bernie Fraser became the governor, and we won the 90 election. But as a new governor with an old board, he wanted to keep the board together, and there were some interest rate hawks on the board who wouldn't agree to cut the rates. So the truth is the Reserve Bank left the rates up were too slow to put them up, and they were too slow to get them down. The end result was the soft landing we were seeking to engineer ended up a hard landing. But because I was trying to build for the first time ever a truly independent central bank, I couldn't give them an instruction to lower the rates. You see, in the end you're caught, you know. So, and I couldn't go out and say, oh, by the way, it's not me, it's that Reserve Bank. So I took the rap, you know, and I said it was a recession we had to have. There's a point of history which is important here. Don Russell went round to see, Don and I went round to see, he was my private secretary, went round to see Bob. We said, Bob, look, the national accounts are out and bad luck, we're 0.2% in reduction under those 2 consecutive quarters. There's technically a recession. Of course, in the national accounts a year later, there was no technical recession, you realise. You know, it turned out we could have avoided it altogether. And we said, look, we don't, what can we say? You know, the banks basically kept the rates up too high for too long. But there's no point in pretending there's not a recession either, because you can feel it out there. But it is a recession we had to have, because we would have burnt the place down again. The accord would have been shredded and we would have gone back to double-digit inflation. So I said, I'm inclined to say this is a recession we had to have.
But
and Bob agreed with that.
But I've always thought you were too much of a truth teller, in that the analysis was absolutely right.
Yeah, well, maybe I should have taken your. I should have had you around then. I know. Bob can't ever recall that conversation.
I now lecture on your government to my students at La Trobe, and I get to a certain point, and I once had someone who was in the building trade, and I said, "What did Paul Keating say at this moment?" And
well, in the end, look, it was
a recession we
had to have. The truth is, we didn't want it to be that hard, and it didn't need to be. That's the truth of it.
Let me. I think. I mean, my guess is that your prime ministership, your long-term career will be noted for the economic transformation of the country, and I think now I have to say the unambiguously good result of that, which I took a long while to understand, I have to say about myself. But I think your prime ministership will probably be noted by historians for the Keating vision, the cultural vision, that I think a lot of the economic work needed to be consolidated, that was done. I'd like to take you through some of that if I could.
Sure, yeah.
You said something in a talk you gave, that one of your great regrets about having lost office in '96 was that you weren't around to deepen the reconciliation movement and the whole way in which government, Indigenous people relate to each other. Could you say something about that? I mean, both about your hopes for that and also what's happened since.
Well, there's a more general point, Robert, and it's this, that we reformed the Australian economy in the nick of time. In the nick of time, you know, as globalisation really got going, and as we saw the growth in East Asia coming, our openness to that economically was central to what we had. But because in public life time is always running out on you, you know, governments start dying the moment they're born, that I wanted to try and jerk the country into, having got the economy going, to try to guarantee our place in Asia. In other words, psychologically, to want to be in it, to want to be in Asia. And so therefore, I thought that, you see, it's worth knowing. Before I became Prime Minister, no Australian Prime Minister ever went to anything but the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting or the South Pacific Forum. There was no APEC, there was no G20, there was none of that. So, you know, if you look at Bob Hawke's years and Malcolm Fraser's years, they were all spent in the Commonwealth, you know. They were spent with Zimbabwe and South Africa and apartheid. And I used to say to Bob, and he never liked this saying, I said, Bob, he said to me one day, you don't appreciate what I've done in foreign policy. I said, look, I do, Bob. I'm with you on apartheid. But Australia's vital interests are not in Africa. They're here. They're with Indonesia. They're to the north of us. And Bob went to Indonesia once in 9 years, you know. So I wanted to sort of correct this, to try and move the place. It meant we had to go there. This is where the Republic fundamentally comes from. This is where, in a sense, Indigenous policy comes from a number of places, but including that, and of course foreign policy. Indigenous policy was that, we buckled with legislative land rights. When Bob proposed it in '84, Brian Burke and Graham Richardson knocked Bob over and he gave it up. And I used to say to him, listen, even if there's a pair of us, you and me, go to the Labor Party conference on our own, we'll just about get this through. But he wouldn't do it.
Why wouldn't he?
Well, his nerves went, Bob. He went down the hole in '84, and he didn't have the guts for it. He didn't have the fight for it. So the end result was it sat there undone, unfinished business until the Mabo decision. The Mabo decision was, a very important and great decision, but it had been done in high courts in other countries, in the United States and Canada. So what the High Court said was, in Australia we have a thing called common law title to land. That comes out of European custom and tradition. Over the centuries we have a custom and tradition which we imported from Britain, which in it has a title to land. What the High Court said is, from this day on, Aboriginal custom and tradition will also be a source of the common law, including in which there is a title. But who has a title, we don't know. What is a title, we don't know. And who can get it, we don't know. That was it. In other words, they just dropped this little bundle on us, and that was that. So I had the choice in '92 of either constructing this piece of property and cultural law to make certain about native title, or to leave it to be extinguished by grants of interest in lands by the Queensland and West Australian government. The Queensland and West Australian governments would have wiped native title out. So there was an urgency about doing it, and I brought the Aborigines and the Torres Strait Islanders right into the cabinet process for their first time ever.
Probably one and only time.
One and only time, and we built this massive piece of property and cultural law from the ground up, because it was the thing that Australia wouldn't face up to, the original colonial grievance, the dispossession. We wouldn't face up to it, and frankly neither would the Labor Party. So basically I hocked the government on native title. I hocked it. It took me 8 months to do it in '92, and we got the thing through. Since then, of course, a more conservative High Court is applying black letter property law to the cases, and
yes,
the whole case flow has slowed down. But fundamentally it was done then. So I thought, if you look at the Aboriginal community and the issues, the first thing was the dispossession, and native title did something about that materially for the first time ever. And then, of course, I set up the social justice package, which was the land fund to buy back pastoral leases which no longer qualify for native title, and I set up the Children in Custody Royal Commission, the one that
yes,
Kevin finally said the sorry to, and we got onto the social justice programs. Now, had I won in '96, I would have pushed all that on a big plane forward, and I would have been the Aboriginal Affairs Minister. I wouldn't have given anybody else. Yep.
Can I ask a question about that? A really difficult question. Why do you think Australia, for so long, has not been able to accept the simple truth about the injustice of the dispossession? I mean, I think Redfern was a kind of changing moment, but and in Whitlam also accepted it. But it's been so hard, and I think still is hard, for the Australian people to accept that in the foundation of the country an injustice of a very serious kind occurred.
Yeah.
Why is it so difficult?
I think it's just all the attendant cultural stuff about the monoculture, that, I mean, you look at the British, they landed in Port Jackson in New South Wales and claimed a hinterland of 1,500 miles as their own. I mean, the arrogance of it,
Yeah.
I always thought this. First of all, the original grievance is the dispossession, so we had to do something about it. And I've never quite understood why this was such an affront to conservative Australia. I mean, history is not an affront, shouldn't be an affront. But the Blaneys and the black armband view of things, these people, I mean, they'll get relegated to the dustbin of history. It's just that they're a headache on the way through. You know, that's a real issue. I mean, history will just wash them out. But it's just that the thing about the Conservatives in Australia, you've got to drag them all the time to everything, you know. Drag them to Medicare, drag them to superannuation, drag them to, you know. And then you get a shellback like Howard, who's basically, a sort of 1950s reincarnate. Then, of course, you've got it all going. It was mad of them, I think, to try and do what they did in changing the debate about reconciliation and about dispossession. I mean, it was in their interest, I think, to have faced up to it. But there was the other more general point, and that is, here we are we're saying, look, we've now got a new economy, we've inherited a continent. I mean, you've got to keep remembering this, you know. I often say, you know, people always gets a laugh, so I'm not saying it for a laugh, but when they were giving out continents, not many people got one. But we did. There's 20 million of us. And it's got the bounty of the minerals and the oil and the gas and the riches. So I wanted us to be psychologically see us as part of the East Asian hemisphere, not as Asians, nothing other than Australians, but look at this great society to our north, you know. 6 flying hours across the Indonesian archipelago, 230 million people. We go to Bali for our holidays. Why can't we celebrate that society as some place we want to know and have kinship with, you know?
Yeah.
But I felt that the idea that we go there hanging on to a worn-down European monarchy, flying a flag with the Union Jack in the corner, treading on the Aborigines. In other words, we're saying to the Indigenous of the region, we're the new Australian community with a polished up economy and a good heart, but by the way, we're not good-hearted to our own Indigenous, and by the way, we still have Queen Elizabeth II as our head of state, and by the way, we're still waving that little flag, you know. It's just so weak, you know. So it's true that we wrapped probably too much at once in the last gasp of it all. But again, you know, you never know how long you're going to be around. You know, I had Dolly Downer for a few years in his fishnet stockings, you know. If I could have kept him another year, I would have won again.
Well, let's take that up. Despite the desire of, I imagine, many people in this audience, you did lose in '96, and John Howard replaced you. I've wondered, and this is something that's not in your book, or at least I didn't find it much, a kind of theory or explanation for the '96 election loss.
Yeah. Well, the book's a book of speeches, and I've never been asked, and I haven't gone around ever speaking in a sort of structured kind of way about those outcomes, you know. But, the big recovery was '93. The recovery, so when I replaced Bob, we were 28% in the Bulletin poll and about 30 in the News poll. I took that to 44.9 primaries. Yeah. It was the biggest recovery since the Second World War of an incumbent government. Whereas in 1990, 3 years before, Bob had got 39% of the vote and lived with the Greens' preferences.
Democrats.
Yeah, with Democrats, the Democrats and Green preferences. Whereas in '93, we more or less won it in one go. Yeah. That was going to be hard to keep up. But So in the end, I got 38.9 in 96, which is still 10 percentage points ahead of where the federal Labor Party is now. But losing is losing. The trouble is in Australia, there's no such thing as a landslide. Once you get over 50% plus one, the seats just tumble to you, you know, and if you go back the other way, they tumble back the other way. But, you know, I just needed more time. If I'd had a 4-year parliament, I had Carmen Lawrence all through 1995, took up 6 or 7 months of the time, that Royal Commission. By the time I got onto Howard, I had him by November a blithering wreck, you know. He went off for his holidays to Hawke's Nest. He was, you know, he didn't know he was coming or going. If I'd had another year, I would have done him what I did every other day, was tread on him, you know. He never got on top of me in the polls, you know. I used to just literally tread on him, day in, day out. And I would have massacred him through 96 if I'd have got another year. But I didn't have the time. I just didn't have the time.
And you don't... I mean, one of the obvious things about that election was that political correctness as a sort of issue began to emerge. The most, you know, that Graham Campbell won as an independent in Kalgoorlie, but even more importantly, someone called Pauline Hanson won in Bill Hayden's old seat. It seemed to me something was happening in the spirit of the country at that time, almost like a sort of a resistance to the big picture of Republic and Asia, reconciliation.
And reform.
And reform, economic reform, a sort of a weariness with change and a sense that we want to go back.
Yeah, that's right. Well, look, the glib little guy gets up and says, "That Mr. Keating, you don't have to worry about him anymore. All these reforms he's pressed on you, you don't really need them.
Relax.
You know, you can relax and comfortable. And by the way, we don't agree, wink, wink, nod, nod, what he says about Asia, you know, what he says about the Republic, you know, what he says about native title, etc. And of course, you know, you're only talking about, what are you talking about? You're talking about 5 votes in 100. That's what you've got to shift, 4 or 5 votes in 100. Well, you know, in the end they were movable. Now, could we have done better? Well, you can always do better, but it's hard. The other thing is the Canberra Press Gallery sold out. Those rats and barnacles of the press, Canberra Press Gallery. They were in the big reform phase, and then they got bored with it.
They just wanted change.
They wanted a change. They got bored with it, you know. I remember it started, Michelle Grattan, who I have a lot of time for, but she said this, in 93, I went to the press club to explain again the government's position. On the Thursday before the Saturday election in 93, John Hewson wouldn't go. And she wrote in a column what a clever strategist John Hewson was, because he didn't appear at the press club, whereas that kind of old fool Keating came to answer the questions for us. And I thought, what chance have I got with these guys, where I wanted to lift accountability to a new standard in a reasoned discussion over a decade or more, and they're saying, no, the smart thing to do is to ignore us.
Yeah.
It's now de rigueur to ignore us. So, of course, from 93 to 96, I ignored them, I have to say that. And, of course, they never forgave me for it. In truth, I shouldn't have ignored them, but they were so ordinary, they kind of had to be ignored.
I want to turn to what you've had to say about politics after 96. When Labor finally returned to office in end of 2007, you wrote some things in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, which I thought, yes, this is what I think is right. And the essence of it was, I suppose, that Australia had lost its moral compass during the period of the Howard government, and that this matters because it can act like a kind of poison on the national soul, and that there will be costs, a price to pay for that loss of moral compass. I suppose what I'm asking you is to say something about that. What do you think?
Well, look, I rang Kim Beazley. I was abroad and I rang him when the Tampa happened. And I said to him, look, I'm going to tell you something your father told me. And he said, what did Dad say? And he said this, when a conservative force is met with a more conservative force, the more conservative force wins. So it doesn't matter whether you do handstands, you'll never outdo Howard on this issue. I mean, Howard, see, I think it's a Prime Minister's duty, one of the primary duties of a Prime Minister is to protect the country from prejudice. Howard was happy to let the racism virus out. And it's like a flu virus. You never get it back. You know, when someone at the top of the system, you see, Bob before me, Malcolm Fraser before him, Gough Whitlam, John Gordon, none of us would ever play around with this issue. None. The only one to do it was a little guy from Bennelong. Yep. And once he was prepared to do it, the Labor Party should have stood its ground, I think, and said, look, here we have a continent of our own, we've signed the UN Refugee Convention, we've actually set up a system of assessments. We set the system of assessments up so people just didn't disappear in the economy. We didn't know where they were from or whether they had tuberculosis or what, you know, and we could reprocess them through and move them along. But when something like that happens, you have to attack it, in my opinion. You've got to go for it, and you've got to risk it. See, at that stage, Labor Party was way ahead of Howard in the polls. Yeah. And we drifted back on this thing, and we've never recovered on the issue since. It's still a current issue, you know.
I mean, just a couple of things about that. One is, I think in present circumstances, the letter that Pauline Hanson wrote to the local paper that caused all the fuss and got her losing her pre-selection for the Liberal Party, we wouldn't even notice anymore. I think there's been such a shift in attitudes towards racial questions since that time. Yeah. I'd say that. But I suppose the question I want to ask is, do you think since the de-election of John Howard, since 2007, the poison has left the national body?
No, I don't. No, I think the poison's still there, and I think it has to be, there's got to be an exorcism takes place here, right? And,
can you suggest that?
And, and you've got to, you see, look, the great event, the great contemporary event of our age is the return of China to its position of primacy in the international system, you know. Before 1800, China was the largest economy with the largest GDP. You know, the Industrial Revolution saw quickly a little country like Britain have a bigger GDP than somewhere like China. With the equalisation of productivity across the world now, the states with the biggest populations will again have the biggest GDP. And China will have a bigger and larger...
It's like a return to the 18th century.
It's a return to, it's going... The Chinese missed 2 centuries, and we're returning to the world the way it was in the 18th century. Now, this is the event of our time. How do we go wandering around having a debate about racial questions here? 20 million of us occupying a continent, you know. I noticed Bill Hayden saying the other day, I think when Prince William and his attractive wife move nearer to the throne, this will give new life to the monarchy, you know. God help us, God help us. You couldn't breathe life into that old horse, it wouldn't matter what you did. But the fact that we're still, we're still going on with it, we're still going on with it. I mean, if you remember the Chinese Politburo looking at us, could you fathom us? You couldn't. And to have this poisonous debate about race. You see, it's very interesting that parties of the right, most of them have one thing in common, one policy in common. And whether you're talking about people like Hanson, or we're talking about Howard, or Eugène Terreblanche, who's now dead, but in South Africa, or Lee Pen in France, Or, of course, and I'm not comparing any of these people to Hitler, they had a commitment to one policy, citizenship. Who is in and who is out?
Exclusion.
Who is in the human community, who is in the civic community and who is in the human community? And if the human community want to become part of the civic community, verboten. Now, there's that line run through a lot of them, you know, and the truth is that the Labor Party in my years we did not have this in common with these parties on immigration, on citizenship. So therefore, this is a sort of live matter on the right. But how do you win it in a world like this? You know, where, I mean, the developed economies now account for 13% of world population. Europe, all the people with white faces and round eyes, you know. Europe, North America, Australia, Canada, you know. We occupy 13% of the world. China and India alone occupy 33, and if you throw in Brazil and Argentina, you're at 50. 50% and growing at 6% a year. The other lot at 13% are growing at 1.5% a year. There's no question about which game you want to be in. You want to be in the 50% game, you know. But you can just see the way in which the world's changed. This year, 2/3 of all world growth has come out of the developing economies. And we think we can have a debate about the circumstances of someone's birth and their complexion and how they look. I mean, it's sick. This is truly sick.